Pillars of Greek Wisdom by David Norton. This lesson is about individuality and Alexander the Great. In the last session, we discussed Echo and Narcissus, two different individuals with different but similar backgrounds. They both knew what they wanted, but could never connect because of their own environmental grooming. Alexander's life was much different, but there was one thing Alexander, Echo, and Narcissus shared, and that was believing the words and interactions from their superiors. Echo was punished, and Narcissus believed he could look at no one else but himself. Now let's take a look at Alexander's life, according to Stephen Bertman from his book, The 8 Pillars of Greek Wisdom. The education of Alexander. Alexander was not born the great. He became great. How did it happen? The answer is education, and the education of Alexander can be instructive. It can show us how to realize our potential as individuals. Alexander was born in Macedonia in 356 BC. His father was Macedonia's king, a rough-hewn warrior named Philip. Alexander's father became his role model, a leader of men and conqueror of nations, who forged a kingdom out of Greece in the aftermath of the war between Sparta and Athens. Unlike his pragmatic father, Alexander's mother, Olympias, had a mystic temperament. She told her son that Zeus, not Philip, was his real father, and his seed of divinity was implanted in the young Alexander's mind. It led him to dream even larger dreams than he could have otherwise dreamt. Knowing that his son would succeed him, the history of Macedonia kingship was scarred by multiple assassinations. Philip was determined to give his son an education that would fully prepare him for the leadership of Greece. Macedonia was a semi-barbarous country in the eyes of classical Greeks who lived in the south, and they were not known for their high culture. Therefore, Alexander's tutor would have his work cut out for him. Philip sent for Aristotle, a man who had been born in Macedonia and had become a philosopher. He was Plato's most famous pupil. Aristotle schooled Alexander in Greek literature and wisdom, teaching him the very same principles that you have learned from the heroic myths you have read in the 8 Pillars of Greek Wisdom. Two mythic figures came to stand in Alexander's growing mind, Hercules and Achilles. Each had attained everlasting fame through superhuman efforts. But being the son of Zeus, Hercules was, in a sense, Alexander's half-brother. Alexander also claimed descent from Achilles, the ancestor of Achilles. Thus, his mythic role models were virtual members of his family. When Alexander went to war, it is said he slept with 2 objects under his pillow, a dagger and a copy of Achilles' tale from the Iliad. When he ruled as king, Alexander issued coins bearing his heroic likeness, wearing the lion skin cap Hercules wore after slaying the Nemean lion. Alexander's character was thus shaped by his upbringing, by his father who served as a role model, by a mother who taught him to dream, and a teacher who instilled in him the inspiring values of a higher culture. Alexander was not perfect. He aimed high, drove himself hard, and failed in his greatest dream. But that is only proof that he was Greek in spirit and human like ourselves. If we aim low, we will never hit the mark. If we drive slow, we may never reach our destination. But if we dream small, we will die as small as our dreams, like Echo and Narcissus. Alexander saw himself as a rational individual. He drank in freedom and was consumed by curiosity. He sought self-knowledge by testing his limits through the pursuit of excellence. In the process, he fulfilled his humanity. His name in Greek aptly meant defender of man. Long after his death, his name lives on in the name of every person called Alexander or Alexandra. Then do not forget Alexandria, Egypt, the home of the first renowned library. But his name also lives in myth. because Alexander the man became Alexander the legend. We can ask no less of ourselves as parents or of our schools. Our children may not have famous forebears of legendary ancestors, but we can teach them by example, help them to dream, and instill in them the guiding principles of a purposeful life. And though as adults we may lack an Aristotle to school us, we can still avail ourselves to his wisdom and that of his ancient peers. Their voices are as near as the nearest library and bookstore. They are there every day, patiently waiting for us to learn from them, to explore their valuable spirit through their words, and to collaborate with us in the greatness that exists in the life of our mind. After reading this, I have a few questions. Unlike Echo and Narcissus, his parents were role models for the creation of his greatness. In what ways did his parents influence Alexander? To what extent do you think his mother inhabited his mind with the thought that he was the son of Zeus, a god? Do you think that from the time Alexander was born, his mother referred to him as a son of Zeus? Does this happen in today's life? Do people create imaginary people and encourage their children to be like them? Was it good for his mother to claim that his father was Zeus and not Philip? Clear deception, or maybe even a lie. Was it fate that formed individuality of Alexander, or the attitude of his parents? Do you think Alexander admired or envied his parents as much as he did people from the past and Zeus? How did his parental upbringing inhibit Alexander? When Alexander rode into Jerusalem, what did the Jews think of Alexander? I did a little search on this, and I found this information from Jewish history, and I'm going to put a link on it here as well. And it says, I'm just taking some snippets from what I read. It says the Talmud describes the drama of the first encounter of Alexander's arrival to Jerusalem. Simon the Just came forth with other members of the priesthood, as well as sages of the Sanhedrin, to greet Alexander at the gates of Jerusalem as he strode in on his famous white horse, which he rode all over the world in his conquest. According to the historians of the time, it was an enormously tall horse, and Alexander was an enormously tall person. Plus, he always wore a plumed helmet. Combined, Alexander stood about 13 feet high on the horse. He was an awe-inspiring sight to behold. He arrived in Jerusalem during the reign of the great high priest, the last of the men of the great assembly, Simon the Just. Most historians say that he came in about the year 329 BCE. He was dead by 323 BCE. The Jews were terrified of the now victorious Greeks because they had backed Persia in the war. There were two choices. One was to fight, which is what the Jews did later with the Romans. The second was to somehow come to an accommodation with the enemy. Alexander was not a pagan because Aristotle was not a pagan. Aristotle's concept of God was that a creator exists. The Greek philosophers referred to God as the first cause. Alexander pushed the button, so to speak. However, once he did not do anything more. What happened on earth did not interest him. Therefore, there was no interference from heaven as to what happened on earth. It was another way of unburdening themselves of conscience, except now with the stamp of belief in God. Nevertheless, the Greeks believed that God existed, which is very important because it will help explain one reason why Alexander was able to tolerate the Jewish religion, whereas many of the Persian emperors were not. Aristotle knew that all the stories of the gods, from Apollo to Zeus, were made up. Alexander, as Aristotle's student, also believed that, thanks to Aristotle, therefore the ideas of the Jews were much more acceptable to Alexander. What do you think this statement represents? It was said, therefore there was no interference from heaven as to what happened on earth. It was another way of unburdening themselves of conscience, except now with the stamp of belief in God. What does this statement say about the Greeks? What does it say about the Jews? How are these statements different? Christians focus upon the person of Jesus Christ and his Father God, while people in Greek mythology focus on the function of the character and the idolization of being like their idol. Are these two different ideologies compatible, or do they create conflict in our soul? Is it better to look at the supernatural, such as God, as representing everything, or to have a supernatural existence represented by many names describing the events of life? Do both of these ideologies exist in today's world? Can you see how they're different? Greek mythology was focused on the actions of people in stories, whereas in the Hebrew teachings, the focus is on one person becoming God, like Abraham wanted to show to God his allegiance by sacrificing the most important thing in his life, Isaac, thus showing or lifting himself up to God. Sacrifice was not an issue to show God his allegiance with Alexander, but being the best he could be during his time on this planet. How do these two different ideologies live in our lives today? Do you think Alexander asked a lot of questions, not only to his parents, but also to Zeus and other gods of Greek culture, searching for answers through the Iliad and Odyssey and other stories? Was that a good thing?